On Face the Nation, John McCain, and he is not happy with the president's response to the demonstrations in Iran. At least 10 people were killed, more than 100 injured as the protests grew even more violent. The Iranian leader is telling the United States to keep hands off. But what are America's options? We'll ask Senator McCain, who wants the United States to take a tougher line. But what then? We'll ask about that and the other front-burner issues, North Korea, Guantanamo, and the future of the Republican Party. Then I'll have a veteran's guide to a successful Father's Day. But first, Senator John McCain on Face the Nation.
Face the Nation with CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Bob Schieffer. And now from CBS News in Washington, Bob Schieffer.
And good morning again. The latest from Iran. The Iranian state television says 17 people have been killed and more than 100 injured as the protests continue on the streets of Tehran. The Iranian government is blaming it on terrorists. And today, Iran's President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad told the United States and Britain to stop interfering in Iran's internal affairs. Yesterday, President Obama turned the rhetoric up a notch when he issued a written statement that said, "The Iranian government must understand that the world is watching. We mourn each and every innocent life that is lost. We call on the Iranian government to stop all violent and unjust action against its own people." Here to talk about it this morning, Senator John McCain. Senator, you have been very critical all week of the president and the line he has taken. What exactly do you want him to do?
Well, I appreciate the statement that he made yesterday that was far stronger, and I think we need to continue to send that message. Bob, you and I are both students of history. In fact, we've had a chance to observe some history. But back on July 4th, 1776, our founding fathers declared one universal principle that all of us are endowed with certain inalienable rights. And this is a human rights issue. This is an issue about whether people can freely demonstrate their disagreement with their government without being beaten and killed in the streets. And this is a long, long history of American advocacy and leadership for human rights. Now, I'm not for sending arms. I'm not for fomenting violence, nothing except to say that America's position in the world is one of moral leadership. And that's what America's all about. And frankly, it's not only what's about taking place in the streets of Tehran, but it's also what takes place in America's conscience.
Well, let me just ask you this, Senator. The president is obviously walking a very fine line here. If he takes a tougher line, he could run the risk of letting the Iranian government use that as an excuse to blame it on us, the great Satan, as they call us.
Well, first of all, the fine line is being dictated by the brutality in the streets of Tehran and the other cities in Iran. The United States hasn't done anything except to what we should do, and that is, as we did in the Congress on Friday, and that was a joint resolution, Congressman Berman and Pence in the House and Senator Lieberman and me in the Senate, again reaffirming our conviction that people have the right to peacefully disagree with their government. And so here we are again having to be on the right side of history. We have to be on the right side of history. Well, now, every time that there's been a totalitarian or dictatorial government that has faced protests from their citizenry, they blame the United States. When the Prague Spring took place, there were many on the left in American politics. Don't encourage them. When the workers of Gdansk in Poland were fighting for their freedom, we shouldn't interfere. We did give them moral support. After the Berlin Wall came down, guess what? They said, you were the beacon of hope. One of the great honors of my life, and I'm sure yours, is to meet Nathan Sharansky. After the president's Axis Evil Empire speech, he said it spread like wildfire throughout the Gulag. There were those at that time that said, including the then Soviet Union, don't interfere in our affairs. America has the moral obligation. And again, that does not mean that we are for sending arms or anything else, although we certainly gave assistance to certain elements during the Cold War.
But let me ask you this. What if the president does really ramp up the rhetoric? What if he takes a much harder line? And then the Iranian government simply ignores it, the crackdown is brutal, people are killed. What does the United States do then?
Well, I think we're faced with the same dilemma that we were during the Cold War throughout centuries. If I could give you very briefly, Daniel Webster, one of the great senators in history, spoke about the Greek Revolution in 1823, and he said, when he was responding to people that said that mere rhetorical support would do no good, and I quote him, he said, "I hope it may. It may give them courage and spirit. It may assure them of public regard, teach them that they're not wholly forgotten by the civilized world, and inspire them with constancy in the pursuit of their great end." And then he said, whether it helped or not, he said it was due to our character and called for by our own duty. Daniel Webster was right then. Ronald Reagan was right. Harry Truman was right. Scoop Jackson was right. Jack Kennedy was right when he said we'll go anywhere and bear any burden. The fact is that America has been and will be the beacon of hope and freedom. And we are not saying that the people who are now risking their lives, and some giving them in the streets in cities and towns in Iran, but we are saying we're on their side as they seek freedom.
What Senator Richard Lugar, ranking Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee, said this morning there could be a very brutal outcome to all of this. He thinks it's very dangerous what's happening. He also suggests, Senator, that President Obama or Secretary of State Clinton should sit down with their counterparts and talk about this in the Iranian government.
Well, first of all, we ought to decide which government to negotiate with. That certainly a lot of the Iranian people aren't exactly expressing confidence, the one that is in power now. But shouldn't we, before we decide when to sit down and what to talk about, see what happens in this train of events, which has surprised literally every expert that's taking place in Iran today? Yes, it is in our national security interest to negotiate Iranian nuclear acquisition or movement toward weapons and missiles to launch them. But is this the time to talk about that? Shouldn't we see how this whole thing plays out and spend our time giving our moral support?
Well, what are our options besides just giving moral support right now?
Actually, we don't have a lot. We didn't have a lot during the Cold War. And we may have made a mistake when we gave too much encouragement to the Hungarian Revolution. But during the Prague Spring and in Poland, still talk to Polish people today. They'll say, you were the beacon, you were the hope. And yet there were many who said, no, no, you will incite violence, there will be further repression. Bob, we've seen this movie before. And again, it's not so much about Iran, although it certainly is at the moment, but it's also about being on the right side of history. And I don't consider it meddling when you stand on the side of the principles that made our nation the greatest nation in history.
Speaking of history, there's a lot of history being made right now. The next thing that comes to mind overseas is North Korea.
Yeah, but before we leave Iraq, could I just mention one thing very quickly? The workers in Gdansk and the Poles, we gave them printing presses, and that was a key element in doing so. You know what America, either intentionally or unintentionally, has given these young people? We've given them Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and they are communicating in an incredible fashion. It's unbelievable, the spread of information that's going on. And again, if I might say, I'm very proud that these are American technologies that they're using to such incredible effect. It's a wonderful thing to see.
All right.
Yep.
Point well taken. Let's talk about North Korea. What do you think the North Koreans are up to here? I mean, it seems like every time we make an overture to North Korea, nothing happens. It seems to get worse. Now we're told, a North Korean vessel with a suspicious cargo headed out, U.S. ship, the USS John McCain, which is named for your father and your grandfather. is on patrol to intercept that ship, apparently. But what happens? The UN resolution says that they may try to stop that ship and ask permission to come aboard. But what happens if they don't give permission?
Well, that's a $64 question here, Bob. What happens if the ship doesn't give them permission to board? And any ship, North Korean ship, that has missiles or equipment or nuclear technology on board probably isn't going to give that permission. And I might add that in recent testimony last week before Congress, our leaders testified that there is North Korean and Iranian cooperation on nuclear weapons and proliferation. So the Security Council measure is a half measure. It's inadequate because right now apparently that ship may be going into a port at Myanmar, or if it went to any other unfriendly nation, then the course of action to be taken is to, quote, report it to the Security Council.
Should we report it anyway?
If we have hard evidence that that ship is carrying technology, equipment, missiles that are in gross violation of the UN Security Council resolutions, I think we should board it. It's going to contribute to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction to rogue nations that pose a direct threat to the United States. Now, I would like for the United States to go back to the Security Council, but most of all, I'd like for China to step in and do what is in China's interest, not to have a nuclear-armed aggressive Korea and a Japan, which will have to feel they have to be nuclear-armed, and other nations in the region. It is in China's interest. China is the country that really has the influence. And finally, as you know, seems to be some transition of power, which is always a very, very dangerous time where regimes of this sort are concerned.
And that brings us to part two of what's unfolding here, is that ship is making its way there. The North Koreans have suggested they may fire some missiles into the Pacific. The Secretary of Defense has put missile interceptors in Hawaii. He's put a ship out there to track it on radar. Do you really think the North Koreans might fire a missile at Hawaii?
I'm not sure they would fire directly at Hawaii. Predicting North Korean behavior is something that I'll predict a lot of things, but not that. But I think they might launch it into the area again, and if it goes over Japan, how would we feel if a country such as North Korea were doing that over the United States? This is a very dangerous business.
So what do we need to do here? I mean, nothing we've done so far seems to slow them down at all.
Well, I'd love to tell you we will get more cooperation from the UN Security Council, but that's a bit too optimistic, to say the least. China has to understand that North Korea is a vital element in our relations, and it is in China's national interest. We're not asking for act of charity. They control their economy, they control a whole lot of things, and they're really the only nation that has influence. It should be a fundamental and vital aspect of our relations with China, and we should continue to work through the normal channels such as the UN. It's a very dangerous game that they're engaged in.
We're going to take a break here and come back and talk about all these other things that we need to talk about in a minute.
You have questions. Who can give you the financial advice you need? Where will you find the stability and resources to keep you ahead of this rapidly evolving world? These are tough questions. That's why we brought together two of the most powerful names in the industry. Introducing Morgan Stanley Smith Barney, here to rethink wealth management, here to answer your questions. Morgan Stanley Smith Barney, a new wealth management firm with over 130 years of experience.
Oil, energy, the environment. Where are the answers? This isn't a liberal or conservative issue. It's a human issue. As an energy company, Chevron has a great responsibility. So we've improved our own energy efficiency 27% since 1992. And now we ask you to join us in one of the most important efforts of our time. Using less. Will you join us? Chevron, human energy.
We're back now with Senator John McCain. I want to just go back to Iran. What exactly, Senator, do you want the president to do?
I'd like to see the president be stronger than he has been, although I appreciate the comments that he made yesterday. I think we ought to have America lead. When you look at the statements by President Sarkozy, Chancellor Merkel, and Prime Minister Brown have been much stronger. We should lead. And I also think he should point out that this is not just an Iranian issue. This is an American issue, what we're all about. Bob, I opposed waterboarding because I thought it was torture. And I did so because I thought it was a fundamental human rights issue. The United States' commitment to observing human rights and the rights of the individual. This is really, I think the president ought to expand this issue beyond just those demonstrators, although they are, certainly our hearts and our sympathy goes out to them and their families.
Speaking of waterboarding, that brings us to Guantanamo. During the campaign, both you and President-elect Obama, or candidate Obama at that time, both said that you thought that it ought to be closed. But you never got around to how do you do it. And now we have that controversy. Your party is steadfast in opposing the president's plan to close it now. What do you want here? Are you willing to help the president work out a plan to close it, or do you think now, on reflection, maybe we should just keep it open?
Again, Guantanamo Bay, and this is a good segue, the prison has become a symbol throughout the world, no matter what the treatment is. The harsh treatment stopped a long time ago, but it's still a symbol out there. The mistake I believe that the president made was to announce the closure within a year without the overall comprehensive policy as to how you address the detainees that you can't send back to the country they came from, those that you want to keep but can't try and convict because they would pose a danger, and you know some who have gone back or already back in the fight, the military commissions, all the aspects that are the tough details that matter whether you would be able to close Guantanamo or not. And so we find ourselves in a quandary with a public reaction, a very strong one, because we haven't formulated or certainly put into play a overall comprehensive policy as to how we're going to address these issues. Yes, I've been working with the president, working with Senator Levin, the Armed Services Committee, Senator Lindsey Graham, and others, and I hope we can resolve this issue soon.
So you are working on some kind of a plan?
Yes, indeed. And we need to, including
well, just
military
tell me,
commission.
basically, what do you think you ought to do with these people?
Well, first of all, I think that we ought to have a military commission that goes through as such as already in the law. I think that if we have people who we cannot release because they would go back into the fight, there has to be a periodic review of their case. And that periodic review could be done by a military commission, a special court, such as here in Washington, D.C., as to whether they should be kept or not. To those that we can't send back to the country that they came from, we should be working with countries that might take them. The fact that we won't isn't a great example. But and then this is, and I'll also emphasize, this is an ongoing issue. There are prisoners now in Bagram in Afghanistan who are foreign nationals, who are not Afghans, and that presents again this policy situation.
Could you foresee ever bringing any of them back to this country?
I think if you convince the American people that you had a safe and secure place to put them, that you had an overall and comprehensive plan to do so, but to just say, we're going to send them someplace in the United States, it arouses the obvious reaction, NIMBY, not in my backyard. And I fully understand that. I don't want them in Arizona either. So we're going to have to, you'd have to now, because of the damage that's been done by we didn't have a comprehensive package. You got quite a selling job. And right now, without a policy, I would not support sending them to the United States either.
So you want to see more details. How do you think President Obama's doing so far?
I think he's done well. I think he has been, if you want to look at a legislative scorecard, he has achieved literally every one of his legislative accomplishments. Unfortunately, it's by picking off a couple of Republicans. It's not been bipartisan. So there really hasn't been that change in the climate in Washington. But, you know, that elections have consequences. On the issue of national security. I think the president is facing a major challenge here, North Korea and others, and so it's sort of an incomplete. Healthcare is another major challenge.
What about healthcare?
I'm on the HELP committee. We have been having these endless conversations and some amendments without two major portions of the bill, with two major portions of the bill being blank. I've never seen anything like it since I've been in the Senate.
And those are?
One on the whether there'll be government plan and whether employers will have to provide, will be required to provide insurance to their employees. I mean, there's the two major fundamental problems with the issue. The Finance Committee, the other committee, as you know, has now said they won't come to a decision on how you pay for it until after the election. Look, a real devastating blow to their plans was a Congressional Budget Office report last week that said the present plan, the one we're considering in the Health Committee, would only insure 1/3 of the uninsured and would cost $1 trillion. Now, you do the math, comes up to $3 trillion, and so far we have no proposal for having to pay for it. Now, banging around out there is the employer-provided health benefits, which I had proposed during the campaign, and so they keep walking up to that edge and then moving back. But we also, in my view, obviously, we have to have a $5,000 refundable tax credit for every family in America to go out and get their own health care. Now, there was a poll today showed that people are willing to pay more taxes for quality health care. But it also says they like their own health care plan. So we could provide people with their own health insurance, and by bringing the costs under control. It's not the quality of health care in America that bothers Americans. It's the cost of health care and the inflation associated with it.
Senator, it's always a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having
being
me
with
on,
us
Bob.
this morning. We'll be back in just a minute.
This portion of Face the Nation is sponsored by IBM. Let's build a smarter planet. Visit IBM.